In 2004, Barnaby Joyce changed the DNA of Australia. Despite being in power for 8 years, John Howard had never had control of the upper house. If he wanted to make a law, it had to be appealing enough to the guys who sat in the middle. This would give him a majority. But to everyone's shock, Howard's ally, Barnaby Joyce, snatched back one of those middle seats in the election. This meant that at last, Howard had his majority and he could finally accomplish what he'd spent a decade waiting for. Making sure that you are not in a union.
Howard gets elected, the world will come to an end.
Now, I am not judging anyone for not being part of a union. Since starting YouTube full-time, I haven't joined the Content Creators Union. Even for me, that's a bit of a stretch. However, there is a reason as to why I could leave my teaching job without the fear of being uninsured should I, say, break my leg. And that's because in this country, workers have a far greater share of the power. But if you stop and think about it, we really shouldn't. Colonial America started as a largely free set of colonies, whereas colonial Australia started with most workers under very strict control of the government. You would think that with the government having much more power, Australia would end up as the more elitist society. Yet in 2004, America's top 1% owned 33.4% of the nation's wealth. Australia's only owned about 18%. This is especially strange given that America had fought for their independence because Britain taxed them without representing them in government. But what you might not know is that Australia also fought against taxation without representation. At Ballarat, upon the discovery of gold in the 1850s, miners from all over the world flocked to Victoria hoping to cash in. However, the Victorian government was actually only weeks old at this point. They simply didn't have the facilities to handle all of these migrants, and so charged a license fee of £1.50 per month to go mining. Now, the story that's often told is that the miners resented being taxed. But that's not really true. They weren't children and they understood how the world worked. In 1851, they proposed a tax on discovery rather than on opportunity. This was met with deaf ears. In 1854, a pub owner in Ballarat called James Bentley blatantly murdered one of the miners, but to the miners' bewilderment, was found not guilty. At this point, enough was enough. The Victorian government wasn't listening to the miners, and with no local Ballarat representative in the parliament, they voiced the same concern as George Washington. We will not be taxed without being represented. Defying the Victorian governor, these miners swore loyalty to the flag of the Southern Cross, and when Hotham sent forces in, some of the miners actually stayed on to fight them. This event became known as the Eureka Stockade, and unlike America's Revolution, it was terribly unsuccessful. Hotham's forces defeated them in just 20 minutes, and they rounded up 13 high-profile participants. But the further you zoom out from 1854, the more that you see that that day actually wasn't a failure. The Eureka 13 were acquitted, Royal Commission deemed that the incident was the government's fault for not listening, and the goldfields were given much better representation in the Victorian government. For America, once the war was over in 1783, they abandoned their wartime mentality. But in Australia, the war never ended, and the fight for justice would only continue. That flag of Eureka became something that was far more important than just a nation state. It represented the value of fairness, and it would be flown whenever that value was in jeopardy. So, right now I'm going to play a little game with you. On your screen, point to where you think the town of Barcaldine is. If you don't know, don't feel bad. It's a huge chapter that's been written out of Australian history. But Barcaldine is right here, pretty much bang in the centre of Queensland. I'd go as far as saying it's worthy of being a pilgrimage destination. Let me explain. So this guy right here is the future president of the United States and actually Trump's hero, William McKinley.
And we will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley, where it should be and where it belongs.
In 1890, he was just a congressman from Ohio, but he really put Trump to shame when it came to tariffs. McKinley proposed that businesses pay an extra 50% to the government whenever they imported from another country. That is 5 times what Trump's just hit us with. Congress agreed to this, and it devastated the Australian sheep shearers who had lost a huge export destination for their wool. With profits going down, sheep stations felt as though they really had no choice but to slash workers' wages. However, in Australia, this was much more difficult to do than other countries. Remember this flag that I showed you before? Well, that became the symbol of fairness, and in the years after Eureka was flown up and down the country. It actually became closely associated with being in a union. And I've made this video for the common man, so if you don't know what a union is, it's negotiating with your boss as a unit rather than just by yourself. It's basically saying that we're a package deal. In 1890, at least per person, we were the most unionised landmass in the world with 200,000 members across 1,400 unions. So when shearers' wages started getting slashed, the shearers' union said no way. Right here in Buckholden, shearers had to work long hours in sweltering tin sheds while their bosses often just sat back, put the radio on, and listened to the Queensland Bulls get pumped by Victor Trumper. The shearers said, "We are not taking this, shear your own sheep." They formed a camp of about 3,000 people and, like at Eureka, took up arms flying the flag of the Southern Cross. Obviously, their bosses weren't willing to give up their good deal, and so they formed their own union, the Pastoral Employers Association. You see, when workers form a union, their united strength compensates for their lack of individual power and creates a pretty healthy balance of power between boss and worker. However, if all the bosses of one industry become a unit themselves, then the gap in power is astronomical. And so, for lack of a better word, the Pastoral Employers Association was OP. Together, shearer bosses agreed to exclusively hire non-union members who really needed the money. As you can imagine, union guys called these guys scabs. In fact, scabs were actually so hated that the police had to escort them to work. So it really did seem like the union was outfoxed by the bosses. But let me explain it this way. You know how in Endgame, Captain America was able to summon Thor's hammer, and then the heroes worked across the cinematic universe to defeat Prime 1819 Thanos? Well, the Union movement had their own cinematic universe. Trust me, the illustration works. Remember, sheep stations made their money from exporting their wool abroad. That meant that it would be sent to ports like Rockhampton, where the wharfies would load up the ships. However, wharfies had their own union and viewed the shearers as brothers in the fight for justice. When the wool arrived from Buckholden, the heavily unionised wharfies refused to load it, saying that they would only do it if they brought back unionised workers. Without it escalating to the level of violence that we saw in 1854, the Buckholden strike saw a true brotherhood committed to the idea of fairness. Eureka was now in our DNA, and workers were willing to cop heat so that everyone got a fair go. Now, at this point, the unions realised that they couldn't just keep reacting to bad situations as they came. They instead had to get on the front foot. So in 1891, they formed a network of candidates who would run for office in the 1892 Queensland election. This network would call themselves Labor. One of those shearers who went on strike was a guy called Tommy Ryan, and he was elected to represent Buckholden. In 1899, the Premier resigned, and for a brief moment, Queensland Labor ran a short-term government, becoming the first Labor government of anywhere in the world. The pipeline would go like this. Workers would join a union. If they wanted to, they could then become a union organiser, and if they proved themselves to be competent, they could be put forward as a Labor candidate for Parliament. It basically ensured that workers had representation in government. But in 1900, the game changed.
On this momentous day, January 1st, 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia has been forged, uniting our fair lands under one banner, truly a federation to make the heart sing. But as we wear the green and gold, we mustn't get lost in the bling.
Oh, by the way, shout out to our patron, Will. We workshopped this idea together, and that's an option to anyone who joins our Year 12 tier. But this is how the first Parliament of Australia looked. Queensland was only a minor player, and it was dominated by Sydney and Melbourne, who had two big hitters: the protectionists, who liked tariffs, and the free traders, who definitely didn't. I've got a more detailed video on it. Essentially, for most of the first decade, Labor agreed to support the protectionists in government, even after they outnumbered them in 1906. I mean, look at those numbers. You would think that they'd be throwing their weight around trying to get huge demands. And that's exactly what happened in 1907. When Chris Watson retired as leader, Andrew Fisher, someone who was part of that 1899 government, took over and he broke Labor off. They then became the government, and an enraged Alfred Deakin took his protectionists to the enemy to become the Liberal Party. So some foreshadowing for Howard here. His beloved party actually started as an attempt to stop a union party. In 1910, the two parties squared off in the first ever Liberal-Labor showdown, and the public spoke clearly. We want to give Labor a go. And Fisher really should be one of our most well-known prime ministers for two reasons. One, he had the best moustache of the early 20th century, and bro had contenders alright. But two, Fisher was intent on making society fair. For instance, the government gained an extra 10% in revenue by taxing unused land, which was something that only wealthy farmers could afford to have. And he then used that money to fund a government-run bank. Not being motivated by profit, this bank could actually offer better rates than other banks, which would force them to drive their interest rates down. Fisher passed other things like workers' compensation, and he built our first ever navy. However, once he retired in 1915, Labor wouldn't get a proper shot at governing until after World War II. I know, James Scarlin was actually a Labor guy, but he was barely in before his government evaporated beneath his feet when Jack Lang and Joey Lyons defected from Labor. By the way, if you didn't know any of that but actually are interested in knowing more, we can sort you out. Rather than buying a book that you don't finish, for the same price, the think tank actually breaks up historians into digestible modules that take less than 5 hours to complete. We already have modules on the Eureka Stockade, the first 10 Prime Ministers, and we're about to drop some new modules on the real focus of today, John Howard. The application takes less than 60 seconds, and I try to get back to you within a day. So, in the midst of World War II, a Labor Prime Minister took over, and his name was John Curtin. However, he died right before Japan surrendered, and so he was replaced with Ben Chifley. Now, from Fisher to Chifley, we saw 2 world wars and a Great Depression. This meant that people had other priorities apart from union membership, and it dropped by 21%. For Chifley, he wanted to make sure that companies didn't pounce on this, and that a fair go for Australians was kept. Following the war, he kept the maximum price limits, subsidised the cost of medicines, and had the Commonwealth Bank set the price for both interest and exchange rates. Andrew Fisher had held the record of 113 laws passed in a single term, but Chifley passed 229. Yeah, it's insane. The bloke was also a train driver as well. But Chifley quite surprisingly lost the election in 1949 to the Liberals' Robert Menzies. And for me, this was the first taste that we had of the public turning on someone for simply restricting greed. A historian called Ross McMullen even said this: people who could not afford a bus ticket when Labor came to office were now up in arms about petrol rationing. So maybe Eureka hadn't permanently changed our DNA as much as we once thought. Now, this is not a slight on Menzies. I genuinely like the guy, but it's unquestionable. Australians wanted to remove the caps that kept our society even, and Menzies sold them on the idea of putting their head above the rest. If you know even just a smidgen of Australian history, you'd know that Menzies dominated the 50s and the 60s, becoming our longest serving Prime Minister. You would assume then that people had given up on unions and that's why he kept winning. But that isn't true. From 1948 to 1954, union membership actually had a slight increase from 56% to 60%. So a majority of Australians were in unions, but a majority of Australians weren't voting for Labor. That's because the Labor Party became deeply divided in the 1950s over just how much distance they put between themselves and the Soviet Union. It would actually take until 1972 to break the Liberals' run, and even then, Whitlam passed reforms at breakneck speed and controversially lost the 1975 election. This video has more on that controversy. So once again, Labor would have to wait, and they had to wait until 1983 to really get a crack at government. And they did the exact opposite of what you would think they would do.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up to die is a bum.
So I'm going to blow your mind here. In 1983, Fraser's Liberal government had actually let wages get too high, and Labor campaigned on freezing wages. Yeah, opposite land, right? Now, so far, I've used the language of having a fair go, and if you are right-leaning, you're probably thinking, dude, you're doing a bit of a sleight of hand here. You keep conflating fair go with having a welfare state, and they're actually not the same thing. And admittedly, for years, that was the mentality of the Labor government. How can we carve the pie up as evenly as possible without going to the extreme of communism? Oh, dude, what's with this woke cottage pie nonsense? Get me a 4 and 20 traveller pie. But Hawke and Keating thought differently. Rather than focus on increasing the slice, focus on increasing the pie. As long as that slice doesn't get trimmed down, a bigger pie will mean that everyone is given a much fairer go than they had before. And it's for that reason that many people argue that it was Keating who nerfed Australia. After all, he stopped championing workers. But I could not disagree more. He never actually shrunk their slice of the pie, and I really do think he just gets lumped in with the guy who came afterwards. So when Hawke took over in 1983 with Keating as treasurer, inflation was really bad. For the last 3 years, it had been at about 10%. That's nearly double the recent cost of living crisis. And absolutely, a lot of it was triggered by hiking up wages too quickly in the years prior. If Keating kept this trend going, then those same workers would actually see the value of their savings dramatically drop. It would also see businesses put up prices in order to keep a profit margin, which would really negatively affect retired workers who weren't getting a salary anymore. So in order to fix this, Hawke and Keating needed a solution. How can we stop increasing the money that's going into your bank account without taking away from your share of the pie? What they came up with was something called the Accords, and honestly, this should be compulsory history. Wages would be fixed to exactly whatever the inflation rate was, effectively a wage freeze. But in exchange, Labor would introduce Medicare. Rather than being afraid to leave your job because you'd lose your health insurance, the government would just cover any health emergency that you had. It was a way of pulling away some of the power that companies had over workers. The unions agreed to this, and every year they would negotiate minor modifications to the deal. And I actually would go as far to argue that Keating didn't just increase the size of the pie, but actually also increased their share. You see, Keating made it compulsory for every company to contribute an additional share of their employees' salary to a retirement fund. The employees could choose whoever they wanted to manage their fund, and so together, workers could choose where trillions of dollars went in the economy. That's sums of money that corporations could only dream of. Keating really increased workers' size of the pie, but in a way that actually avoided communism. He didn't just wave a wand and hand out money, but he allowed workers to get access to huge amounts of private money that would also help companies by giving them investment. By the way, get around the Mr. M History Pod, there's actually heaps more than what's on here. If just 200 of you listening to this gave it a rating and hit follow, that would actually be enough to get us in the top 10 history podcasts in Australia. But there was one more key way that Keating protected workers' slice of the pie. Because our unions still actually had some power, they would negotiate the terms of employment like pay and hours in a particular industry. These agreements are called awards. If we didn't have these and everyone had to negotiate their own salary from scratch, they would be negotiating from a position of no strength. The downside to awards was that in some cases, they actually restricted hardworking and talented employees. So Keating actually allowed for workers to negotiate directly with their bosses for a new contract as long as the award was the minimum starting point. So let's put it like this. You work in the mines and you're not part of the miners' union. You highball your company way above the award, and better yet, you feel no need to pay union fees because you did this all by yourself and not with the help of an award, right? Can you start to see how this could go wrong? It wouldn't be long until the concept of fair go was written out of our DNA. Like America after the War of Independence, we're about to lose our wartime mentality.
I mean, the unions and the Labor Party, they're all part of the one big family. The unions will go through the business of saying, well, you know, if Howard gets elected, you know, the world will come to an end.
Now, I want to get this on record. I really like John Howard on a personal level. It is well worth reading his autobiography, and the dude is really good at leading a team. Unfortunately, that team is committed to diluting the power of workers. But also kind of mad respect, he's such a team player, like goes to all the Liberal Party campaigns and doesn't really air his dirty laundry post-retirement. I do really respect him, but I don't think he made a positive change to our DNA. So when Howard beat Keating in 1996, he fell just one seat short of forming a majority in the Senate. This meant that he couldn't play his hand too hard. What Howard really wanted was to have everyone negotiating their own contracts and to completely dilute the power of being a unit. He literally says this in his book. I genuinely don't think that Howard viewed himself as an evil advocate of companies seeking to crush the workers so that they could take advantage of them. And instead, I'd say that he just believed in individuals rather than in units. And though I do believe that he's sincere in his beliefs, I actually think that this was much more damaging than if he was someone deliberately doing the bidding of corporations. So in 1998, Howard had to drive with the handbrake on. His new workers' laws moved the balance of power back in the direction of companies, but it wasn't as far as he would have wanted. Awards still existed, but they were now joined by something called Australian Workplace Agreements. These were different because unions did not negotiate these agreements. With AWAs, the worker would directly negotiate a contract with their employer, and unlike Keating's laws, it could be below the union-based award. This was on the condition that the Industrial Relations Committee deemed that it gave them, quote, no disadvantage. This commission was stacked with people sympathetic to Howard's view, like Jeffrey Gudichay. The new laws actually also got rid of unfair dismissal laws for businesses with under 15 workers. Now, this is just textbook watering down of unions. Every country's done this before. What was much more subtle was what Howard did the year after. One of the other ways that Keating tried to protect workers was by whacking a tax on capital gains. A capital gain is any profit made from trading something. So if you were to buy a house and to sell it for $100,000, you would pay a tax on the profit. It was the rich who were mostly doing these sales and making their money from, say, a property portfolio while paying no tax. Meanwhile, the poorer workers were getting taxed for their wages.
In other words, the whole tax avoidance industry was about changing the nature of income from income to capital so that they would escape tax.
Now, remember those huge sums of money that were sitting in people's retirement funds? Well, Keating arranged a progressive increase for employers to contribute up to 15% per year. 9% from the bosses, 3% from the worker, and 3% from the government. This would have given huge power to the workers, as they would have been responsible for where titanic sums of money were invested. For someone who believed in individuals rather than societies, this was not good for Howard. But the momentum was already in place, so how do you break it up? Well, Howard changed it so that retirement fund went from being a united fund to a solo one. You see, Howard capped the planned super increase to just 9%, and then in 1999, halved Keating's tax on capital gains. This meant that it was now much more attractive to buy a property, and housing prices proceeded to go like this. In other words, now the retirement fund wasn't your super, but instead your investment property. Howard had changed the game so that property prices would go up at an even greater pace than super. One generation of workers were under the illusion that they were getting a fair go, but Howard had actually just bought them off. Workers now simply had much less power to pull their money together. With super diluted, Howard was able to have a much more decisive say on where Australia's money went, and it wasn't to the workers. In 2004, Barnaby Joyce very unexpectedly got the last Queensland Senate seat instead of Pauline Hanson. This gave the coalition that elusive majority. Having been in for 8 years, Howard knew that he'd get booted out soon enough, and so now was his time to act. Work choices is one of those few pieces of industrial relations law that people actually know the name of. And there was such a strong reaction to this law that it probably cost him the 2007 election. But despite losing the election, I'm going to argue that Howard was still successful in twisting the knife against unions. Work choices was essentially everything Howard wanted to do in 1998, but couldn't do because of the Senate. It aimed to get most contracts off of awards and onto those non-union AWAs. Even on the awards, unions could now only negotiate for 5 conditions: wages, hours, and personal, parental, and annual leave, as opposed to the pre-existing 20 conditions. And the exemption for unfair dismissal was now expanded to businesses with less than 100 employees. If you read Howard's autobiography, he says this about being better off: "I could not in all honesty give the same guarantee in 2005. I knew there would be cases of some people at the margin being employed without penalty rates or overtime, but in the overwhelming bulk of cases, the person would have gone from the dole queue to his or her first job." Honestly, this was like Mitchell Johnson bowling to a tail ender. People left unions for all sorts of reasons. Unions now couldn't fight unfair dismissal laws in many workplaces. With unions unable to negotiate many contracts, people thought, what are they doing for me? And there was just an overarching attitude of, but at least I have a job. And that for me is where it's so hard. Gratitude is a great trait, and well-meaning people were put off unions because they appeared to have a lack of gratitude. But there was a much greater power struggle going on, and on the one hand, that goodwill was taken advantage of completely, and on the other, a generation of workers had been bought off and distracted. This dramatically shifted the balance of power in Australia. Yes, Kevin Rudd reversed most of work choices in 2007, but that couldn't re-steer the ship. In 2005, union membership was 22.3%. In 2007, it was 19%, and by 2010, it didn't increase, even dropping to 18%. I said at the start that in 2004, Australia's top 1% owned 18% of the country's wealth. They now own 26%, and that is only rising. We got nerfed harder than the finesse shot in FIFA 14, and worse still, we haven't realised it. Each day, 150 years of our DNA is getting eaten away. But can you imagine what it would have been like without Keating's reforms? Earlier in the year, I did a whole documentary on how Keating fought both the left and the right, and I summarised a 700-page book into something digestible. Click right here to watch it.